we left off with the idea of context-free grammars and the rules of the grammars as generating phrase structure descriptions for sentences. And we're going to take a look at the leverage that we gain on specifying theoretical constraint and also interface with things outside of what word sequences are okay in the language that we get out of using these phrase structure descriptions as representations of the structure of a sentence in the mind of a native speaker. So I want to start with a very simple example, but it's a very famous example, which is the regularity of the notion of the subject of a sentence and its role in determining the form of a verb in a language like English where there's subject-verb agreement. So the subject of an English clause is something that is very simple to define in terms of the structural descriptions that a context-free grammar offers. In particular, in English, for example, the subject of an English clause is the noun phrase that is the left sister of the verb phrase. And we can go further and say that, in general, phrases have what are called heads. That is, their children, among their children, there is a designated child that is primary in determining the properties of that phrase. And if you keep on going down through heads, you get to the head word when you get to the terminal. And it's the head word of a subject, setting aside the special case of coordinated subjects, which I won't get into today, but you can ask me about if you're interested. It is the head word of a non-coordinated subject that determines the person and number agreement for the verb. So this is an instance of a very famous generalization, which is that in order to figure out what the verb form should be, you don't look and go back and look at the first noun that is linearly preceding the verb that you're asking about, but rather you look for the noun that is the subject of that verb. So in a sentence like "dust from the rocks is on the floor," you can see that the most recent noun before the verb to be is the word rocks, and that's a plural noun. Despite that, the verb form for this sentence should be is, not are. Is the singular form, not the plural form. And the reason is that the generalization about the relationship between a verb and the thing that it agrees with is a structural generalization. It is the phrase, which is the subject of that verb phrase, of that verb, with which the verb is agreeing, and the property that the verb agrees with, which is the number and person properties of that phrase, is determined by the head word. So there's a head relation, which I won't get into in detail, but which you can use to determine what the number value should be for that noun phrase that the verb is agreeing with. In this particular case, that is a singular noun, and so the noun form should be singular. And notice I have, just as a little bit of notation, I put a little star under R here. This would be if I change the word is to are, it would be ungrammatical. Okay, it would not match the agreement requirements of English. Okay, here's a second syntactic regularity. Argument structure. Verbs differ in what we call their argument structure, which constrains the English subject and the children of the verb phrase. What is argument structure? Loosely speaking, argument structure is the set of phrases which denote core participants in the event or state that the verb is describing. And those core participants differ based on the properties of the verb, and those core participants may or may not be obligatorily realized in the sentence itself. So just to give some examples of this, so sleep is a verb that's what's called an intransitive verb. It does not get an object. Okay? And an object, a direct object, in English is a noun phrase that normally immediately follows the verb. So while the sentence "I slept in the bed" is fine, as you see on the left, if I were to say "I slept the bed," you would recognize that as something's wrong. And within the theoretical framework of generative grammar approaches to this kind of distinction, we would say that that's an ungrammatical sentence. That sleep does not allow a noun phrase to occur immediately after it, And notice that that is, once again, a generalization that is stated in terms of the structure, the hierarchical structure of the sentence, not in terms of specific words. And that hierarchical structure is given to us by the grammatical description. So that's, once again, illustrating the power of these context-free grammatical descriptions. Okay. And so we might say that sleep requires that there is no direct object for it. And notice that it's not like totally implausible that I could come up with a meaning for this. So maybe I want to mean this to say that I did something to the bed. In particular, I slept in it and caused it to become a bed of all the beds in the world that has experience with me sleeping in it. So that's a plausible way. Just like if I say, I signed the baseball. Saying I signed the baseball means that the baseball goes from a state to having my signature on it, having a history of my interaction with it. Likewise, if I sleep in a bed, the bed has it, in some sense, cognitively, you can think of it as having a history of interaction with me. However, that cannot be realized as making the bed a direct object of sleep, and that is a syntactic property of the verb sleep. Here are more examples of argument structure, which hopefully bring out a very important point, which is that argument structure requirements are defined on syntactic categories, and they have some relationship with the semantics, the meaning of the verb, but they're not fully predictable from it. Okay, there's some degree of syntax level specificity. So for example, let's take the verb eat. Eat can be used intransitively, like I ate at the meal, and that could actually mean two things. It could mean that when I was at the meal, I ate. I didn't not eat. And another thing might be that I sort of picked at the meal. Both of those interpretations are ones you might have. So that's an intransitive use of eat. Eat can also be used transitively. I ate the meal. Perfectly fine. Now let's take a word that is very, very similar in meaning, but actually turns out to have pretty different syntactic properties. Devour. I devoured at the meal. If you are a native speaker of English, you will instantly recognize as there being something wrong with it. That sounds wrong. Even though, once again, it's plausible that it could mean something. When I was at the meal, I devoured a bunch of stuff. But it's not okay to use the word devoured that way. And that is a syntactic property of devoured. And it's a property that's defined in terms of syntactic categories. The verb devour requires a direct object. This sentence doesn't have it. Therefore, it is ungrammatical. And that, once again, that star indicates that it's ungrammatical. I devoured the meal, as you see in the lower right, is perfectly fine. Devoured is a transitive verb, perfectly okay to use it that way. And argument structure requirements can be very verb specific. So there's some very general cases and there's some very specific cases. One of my favorite examples is the English verb put. Put, as far as I know, is the only verb in English that requires an explicit location argument. So it requires both an object, a direct object, and a location. So I'll contrast it with the word place. I placed the marble carefully. That probably sounds maybe a little bit surprising to you, but it probably also sounds perfectly okay. And the reason is that placed is a transitive verb. It can be used transitively this way. And so all I need is the direct object, the marble. If I got rid of the direct object and said I placed carefully, that would be a very strange sounding sentence, and we would say that's ungrammatical with respect because of the argument structure requirements of place. But notice that I can also specify a location explicitly, which I didn't do in the first example. I placed the marble on the table. Perfectly fine. So place can be used both with just a direct object and with a direct object and a location which specifies where the direct object goes. Contrast that to the word put. I put the marble carefully is, once again, if you're a native English speaker, this will sound very strange to you. And the reason is that put, unlike place, although they mean almost the same thing, it's very hard to pin down what they actually mean that would be different. Put requires not only a direct object, it also requires a location. And so I put the marble carefully sounds weird, and the reason is that it's missing the location. Place doesn't actually require the location, and put does. So I put the marble on the table is fine because both of the requirements are met. Now, how would we describe this in context-free grammars? First of all, what I've hoped to make the case for here is that the structural descriptions are ones that are very useful and valuable for stating generalizations about the behavior of words in their sentence level context. But if you were looking carefully, you'll notice that the grammars didn't actually specify that constraint. And the reason is that I was just giving you a very simple picture of like what the sort of full content of the grammatical category labels might look like. And as you get into the details of writing a grammar or specifying a grammar in a more refined way, you will want to build in mechanisms that also rule out some of those starred sentences, some of those examples that were ungrammatical, and retain the ones that are grammatical. One mechanism within context-free grammars of how you do that is you can enrich the set of phrasal categories to not just have labels like verb, but to also have richer specifications and structure. For example, for argument structure, the verb might also have, we might make a distinction between non-terminal categories, all of which are verb, based on the different requirements for argument structure that they have. So we might have 3 different VP rewrite rules that started out as VP goes to V, VP goes to VNP, and VP goes to VNPPP. And what we might do is we might simply take everything that comes after the verb, and we might actually build that in to the specification of the V label. So now instead of 1 V label, we have 3 V labels. We have a V which has nothing on it, which is an intransitive verb. It can't have a direct object. We have a transitive verb usage, V with the little brackets NP annotated on it. And then we have a very unusual one, V, that requires an NP and a PP. And so now we have these 3, and we haven't created more VP rewrite rules, but we have just changed the V labels and we've created more V categories. And now this becomes something that has a little bit of teeth in terms of predicting some things being okay and some other things not being okay, by saying that different words can be rewritten to from different V labels. So for example, sleep is intransitive. You rewrite V with no arguments to sleep. Eat can be used either intransitively or transitively. You might say that it can be rewrite from V with nothing on it or to V with an NP on it. Devour can only be rewritten from the latter. Place can be rewritten from, it's a monotransitive ordinary verb, and so just the same one. But put has this very unusual NPPP label. Now, that'll start getting you going. If you're looking carefully, you'll notice that there's still not enough information for place, because place also could be used with a prepositional phrase. And that illustrates something else, which is that in addition to arguments, language has adjuncts. And adjuncts are things, without going into great detail, they're words like recently or with abandon or at school that can combine very freely with verbs. They don't have to have a specific set of requirements that the verb offers in order to combine with them. And so we also need a wider set of rules that allow adjuncts like recently, which is an adverb phrase, with abandon, which is a kind of prepositional phrase, at school, which is a kind of locative phrase. Those can also be used. So for example, we might have a verb being used intransitively with a prepositional phrase. So notice now that this PP adjunct is not recorded on this verb right here, and adverb phrases likewise. Okay. And I want to note that it's widely agreed in linguistics that there is some useful distinction between arguments and adjuncts, and there are many cases that are clear, like direct objects in English, but there are others that are harder to classify. And so this is a whole area of deep and rich and interesting investigation, and the relations between the syntax and the semantics in particular are very rich and interesting. And at this point, since you now have a little bit of experience of how you might build in something like an argument structure level specification within a context-free grammatical description, I encourage you as an exercise to try to work out how you would use features to start to build agreement constraints into a context-free grammar fragment for English so that you can distinguish between is and are and what contexts can it be used. Okay. The next thing I want to highlight is syntax and meaning composition. So there is a big principle which plays a huge role in the study of language once we start getting more into meaning, which is the principle of compositionality. The principle of compositionality says that the meaning of a complex expression derives from the meanings of the parts of that complex expression and the rules for combination. And this relates to syntax in the following way. That for the most part, and it's scientifically possible that this is true entirely, meaning composition in the notion of compositionality we're talking about occurs via the hierarchy of the syntactic tree. And this means that syntax immediately gives us an account of many kinds of meaning ambiguities. So let's take in as an example the sentence, I greeted the visitor with a smile. Okay. There's actually two distinct meanings that I want to highlight here. One is something that I might paraphrase as, I smiled as I greeted the visitor. So I was the one who was smiling. And the other is, I greeted the visitor who was smiling. Okay. I'm not going to get into the full details of a theory of composition and semantic composition and syntax here, because that will take us beyond the scope of today. However, just very loosely, the general idea here is that words that modify other words should appear in each other, close to each other in phrases within the scope in which the meaning of the overall phrase is determined. So if we're saying the second paraphrase, I greeted the visitor that was smiling, then with a smile should be inside that noun phrase that talks about who I'm greeting. So once again, remember, if I'm using greeted this way, it's got an object. That object is that noun phrase. And both the words visitor and with a smile are part of determining that noun phrase, who's being greeted. And so with a smile should be inside that noun phrase. And in this structural description, it is. The prepositional phrase with a smile occurs within the overall noun phrase, the visitor with a smile. So we can gloss this as saying with the smile modifies visitor. In contrast, in the other usage, in the other interpretation, I smiled as I greeted the visitor. Here, the visitor with a smile is not a phrase. With a smile is not talking about the visitor, it's talking about the greeting action. And so here, we have with a smile is not inside the phrase, the visitor. Rather, it is inside the overall verb phrase, greeted the visitor with a smile. And so, this syntactic distinction, and interestingly, I want to point out that all of the rules that are relevant for creating this ambiguity, these two syntactic descriptions, are independently motivatable. There are numerous independently motivated ways that you've already seen of how noun phrases can contain prepositional phrases, but also that verb phrases can contain prepositional phrases, with or without a direct object. So the individual pieces are actually separately motivatable, but a cool fact falls out, which is that the ambiguity of this sentence, I greeted the visitor with a smile, is predicted. And that's an incredibly powerful feature of context-free grammatical descriptions, is that they offer automatically an account of a wide variety of the kinds of ambiguities and how words associate with each other and combine with each other in meaning. And this is just one of those examples. We'll see in more. And then the last example of the value of these descriptions I want to illustrate with prosody. Empirically, it turns out that phrasal boundaries, so this P, by convention, we often use this P here to indicate the phrasal status of a non-terminal category. These phrasal boundaries often correspond with prosodic breaks, especially when they're high in a verb phrase. Okay, and that means that I can actually often disambiguate between two different interpretations by changing my prosody. So, for example, you can ask which one of these two greeted the visitor with a smile. Examples am I saying? I greeted the visitor with a smile versus I greeted the visitor with a smile. I was actually referring to the second example here with my first version and the first example with my second version. Once again, the second example, I greeted the visitor with a smile versus I greeted the visitor with a smile. In the latter case, I put a separation where there's a higher level separation between the prepositional phrase and what it associates with. Some of the other examples are even stronger. So for example, she rolled over the carpet versus she rolled over the carpet. In this case, the first one, she rolled over the carpet, is where she's rolling to. And the second example, she rolled over. Rolling over in this case means something she's doing to the carpet. And these create very different interpretations. You'll notice that in the latter case, roll has an object, whereas in the former case, roll does not have an object. And those very different interpretations, who or what is rolling, actually follow the syntax. Here are two more examples of the phrase structure prosody interface. And in or. Every room has sofas or chairs and tables versus every room has sofas or chairs and tables. Once again, the higher level break corresponds to the location of a prosodic boundary, an actual pause in my speaking, and with possessives as well. What's the difference between a friend of John's sister versus a friend of John's sister? Once again, you may be able to reliably distinguish between the two. Okay, we're going to pause here and then go to the last section of today.